going to go on to example 3 of solving polynomial equations. Before we do, a brief reminder. We need to factor any polynomial equations completely before we can solve them. Then we set each linear factor equal to 0. If we have a factor that's quadratic and cannot be factored down to its linear forms, then we use the quadratic formula. Finally, the degree of the polynomial equals the number of zeros or roots or solutions of our polynomial. So let's take a look at example 3. Example 3 is 2 times x to the 4 minus 5 times x cubed minus 3 times x squared equals 0. What we notice is that all 3 of our terms have an x squared in it. Therefore, we're going to factor the x squared out. So we get x squared times 2x squared minus 5x minus 3. And this equals 0. Now, what we want to know is if I take 2 times negative 3, and then I take the factors of negative 6, are there any factors that I could add together to get negative 5? So negative 6, we could have a negative 6. So again, 2 times negative 3. So 2 times negative 3. We know that equals negative 6. We want to look for factors of negative 6, that when we add them together, we get negative 5. So what we know is that negative 6 plus a positive 1 gives us that negative 5. So we can rewrite the quadratic to be 4 terms instead of 3, and then we would be able to simplify and factor by grouping. So we're going to do that. We leave the x squared here. And now we have our parentheses, and we have 2x squared. I'm going to say plus 1x minus 6x minus 3. And all of that equals 0. So I leave the x squared there because it's still part of my equation. And now I'm going to factor by grouping. In other words, I'm going to group 2x squared and x together. And then I'm going to group negative 6x and negative 3 together. So when I do that, 2x squared plus x, they have an x in common. So I factor out the x, and I'm left with 2x plus 1. And negative 6x and negative 3 have a negative 2 in common. So I factor that out. Sorry, they have a negative 3 in common. So I factor that out, and I get 2x plus 1. And again, the whole thing equals 0, so we have to write it each time. Now what I notice is that I have a common factor, 2x plus 1 and 2x plus 1. So I can finally factor some more. So we have x squared times the factor x minus 3 times the factor 2x plus 1. And this all equals 0. Now, I have 2 linear factors, x minus 3 and 2x plus 1, and I have 1 quadratic factor, x squared. Remember that that's going to give us a multiplicity of 2. So I take each one of my factors and set it equal to 0. So we have x squared, we stop scrolling, x squared equals 0. So that means x equals 0 with a multiplicity of 2. That means that those are 2 zeros, 2 solutions. 0 is the same for each, but it is 2 solutions. Then we have x minus 3 equals 0. So I add 3 to both sides, x equals 3. That's my third solution, or my third 0. Then we also have 2x plus 1 equals 0. When I subtract 1, we get 2x equals negative 1. And then we divide by 2. So x equals negative 1/2. So remember that we had a degree of 4. So we had to have 4 zeros. And our 4 zeros are x equals 0 with a multiplicity of 2, x equals 3, and x equals negative 1/2. If you don't understand, make sure that you scroll back, rewind, and redo.